Interesting guests, and one of them was Michael Hayden. This is how Fareed Zakaria introduced Michael Hayden.
So what is the story behind bin Laden's death? What are the consequences? Joining me now is one of America's great spy masters, Michael Hayden. Hayden was director of the National Security Agency on 9/11 and later was the head of the CIA. He's worked under Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama.
Oh yes, the head of the NSA on 9/11. And for people with a very good memory, or people who do check my sources and saw in my recent Last Word on Osama bin Laden video, the link back to that fascinating Milt Bearden interview that took place on the evening of 9/12/9/13 between Dan Rather and Milt Bearden. Well, you would have seen that was a link back to the invaluable September 11th television archive, which I would really hope, if there are people with the ability to do so, please go and just download as many of those files as you can, because that is a valuable treasure trove of information that very few people even know exists. But there are news feeds from ABC, CBS, CNN, all of those major news outlets from 9/11, 9/12, 9/13, and all of those original broadcasts are held there. So that's incredibly valuable information that could disappear at any time. So please, people, go out there and back it up. But at any rate, if you go to that clip, that hour segment that I included as the link back to that Milt Bearden interview, you'll see earlier in that they had a fascinating little interview piece with Michael Hayden, head of the NSA, that they were talking about Osama bin Laden and why it was so incredibly difficult to track him down. Well, Michael Hayden's laughable, ridiculous response is essentially that because bin Laden was using a satellite phone that he procured through his network in America, well, the NSA just can't track that because they're designed to look at foreign devices, but certainly not American devices. Insert uproarious laughter here, because we obviously know that the NSA not only can, but has been and explicitly forces the companies to make all of their devices listenable and backdoorable by the NSA. I mean, we know that so thoroughly now that to see that kind of propaganda coming out on 9/12/2001, well, retroactively you can laugh, I suppose, but laugh in order not to scream in rage. But we all know how that story turned out and how untrackable bin Laden really was until finally the Navy SEALs got him just in time. Oh, it's so wonderful. Well, that's Michael Hayden, and what did he have to say on the Zakaria program about bin Laden's recent death and the ramifications of the killing of the boogeyman in Abbottabad?
So you are very well acquainted with the relationship between the CIA and the ISI. You worked at the Pakistani intelligence agency. Given all you know, is it plausible to you that Osama bin Laden was living in a fortified house 8 times the size of every other house in the area, with no phone lines, all kinds of suspicious activity, and that nobody in the Pakistani military knew, even though this was happening 1 mile from their West Point, their Sandhurst?
Right. Fareed, let me give you a professional and a personal answer. At the professional level, and frankly, this is the best answer I'm going to give you, we just have to let the facts take us where they will. And now that we've got this trove of documents and electronic media from this particular building, some of those facts may be in that mountain of data. On a personal level, it really does tug at credulity to think this could go on without someone, and by no means am I accusing anyone particularly at the highest levels of the Pakistani government, but it's hard to believe this could happen without someone suspecting, at least, what was going on there. I mean, what did the neighbors think? Well, what was the word on the street? What did the local police chief believe? Those kinds of things. I think, in this case, we have a right to know. In this case, the burden of proof is on the Pakistanis.
Finally, General, give us a sense of the consequences. So you talked about the treasure trove of documents. What do you see as the most likely consequence of Osama bin Laden's death?
There are 2 or 3 things that are happening, Fareed. One is the treasure trove of documents, and frankly, I can't remember the last time we did what's called SSE, sensitive site exploitation, against a leading al-Qaeda figure. It's been years. And so this will be very, very important. The second thing is al-Qaeda now has to go through a succession crisis. The word is out that they've got a succession plan. It's Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2. But no plan survives contact with reality the way it was originally developed. So I'm going to enjoy watching how al-Qaeda deals with this. And then finally, Fareed, and this is really important, any member of al-Qaeda, particularly prospective members of al-Qaeda, have to remember this mission. They're going to think about what happened here, that these Americans have great reach, have great precision, and a very long memory. That's a very powerful thing in the kind of war in which we're engaged.
Well, there really, in a nutshell, are all of the key storylines that the CFR and the well-connected elite of the CIA and NSA and other such agencies would like you to take away from the bin Laden death hoax narrative. And in reverse order, we have the admission that this extrajudicial assassination, and which is completely in contravention to every tenet of international law and every tenet of common sense, that a country cannot just go and invade the sovereign territory of another country to go and kill someone that they say, without providing any evidence, is guilty of a crime. Well, obviously that was completely ridiculous on its face, but is justified in the minds of the dumbed-down public because, well, this is the man responsible for 9/11. Therefore, anything is okay when it comes to getting him. And this definitely was a message to people who are aware of what an incredible breach of all standards of international law that is, what an incredible atrocity really it was, regardless of who it was or in what circumstances. The extrajudicial assassination in crossing international borders is very much an international war crime. But we know who the war criminals are, and we know that they, and under the present system, will never come to justice. And I think that's the message that was being sent. And I'm not sure it was being sent to members or would-be members of al-Qaeda so much as really just the average population, people who are actually aware of what's really going on in the war on terror narrative. We also have Mr. Hayden bringing up the incredible treasure trove of al-Qaeda documents that have been snuck out of the Abbottabad compound of the al-Qaeda, al-Qaeda boogeyman. And well, what needs to be said about this story other than what has already been said by people like Paul Joseph Watson in his story from May 14th, 2011, bin Laden's 1 million page cache will be used to legitimize official 9/11 fable. And I would add to that what many other analysts have added, that basically this mythical treasure trove of documents from bin Laden's compound will be able to justify just about anything that the elite mouthpieces want you to hear about and want you to understand about this al-Qaeda threat. Basically, anytime there's anything they want you to be scared of, they'll just bring out a supposed document from this supposed treasure trove of information that, of course, we will never have access to, where they say that al-Qaeda is or was planning such and such a thing. Therefore, we have to do such and such a thing. And we've already seen that starting to be implemented with the no-ride lists that have been proposed for trains in the United States, because apparently al-Qaeda was planning some sort of event on an al-Qaeda or on an Amtrak train track somewhere in the U.S., somewhere around 9/11, 2011. So because of this aspirational plan, which they admit had no basis in reality, it was just an idea in one of these mythical documents that they've supposedly pulled out of their Abbottabad compound. Well, that's going to be used to justify these no-ride lists, like the no-fly lists, which listeners to the Crobrett Report will already know are being turned into no-buy lists. So the cycle of ridiculous justifications for overt tyranny continue, and it all again stems from this bin Laden death hoax narrative. And then, of course, the first thing that was mentioned there is probably the most important in the near future, the geostrategic and geopolitical ramifications of all of this bin Laden death hoax, and that is the fact that he was found 1 kilometer away from Pakistan's equivalent of Sandhurst. And the obvious implication is that he was being hid by the Pakistani military and ISI, and therefore there is going to be a massive ratcheting up in tensions between the two countries and a potential for the actual military extension of the Afghan war into Pakistan. And we already know that that's been going on for some time with the drone strikes, but now it could actually be formalized, and that's especially worrying because, as Webster Tarpley has been noting, China has recently issued an ultimatum to Washington basically saying any attack on Pakistan would be construed as an attack on China. And as we've been going on this podcast time and time again for months on end now, China is the billion-person elephant in the room. Much of what's going on geopolitically is really being aimed at or with China in mind at any rate. And the chess pieces are being lined up for World War III, as we've talked about many times on this podcast. And this is just yet another indication that, again, can be garnered from the open source information that is freely available to the public and is being telegraphed to you by the elite power players, exactly in the same way that the same group of power players at the Council on Foreign Relations were telegraphing the war on terror narrative back in 1998, as Richard Grove pointed out earlier. So where does that all leave us? Well, certainly I hope by this point I have at least established the idea that there is very much value to be gained in taking a look at these types of insider publications and interviews and speeches and lectures and other such ways of finding out through open source methods what the elite insiders are thinking and talking about. There is very much predictive value in doing this, and I think we've demonstrated that from the 1998 example, and we can even apply that to what's happening right now, talking about the bin Laden death hoax narrative and people like Michael Hayden. Or you could continue watching that Fareed Zakaria GPS episode, and later on he interviews the Pakistani ambassador to the U.S. alongside Richard M. Haas. Oh yeah, Richard M. Haas, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations. Surprise, surprise. So, you can watch Richard Haas basically saying to Pakistan in general and to the ambassador in particular, Lucy, you got some splaining to do. And it's, again, shaping up in a very, very obvious direction, and they're telegraphing their punches. So having said that, I think the utility of listening to the enemy has been well established in this episode, but now it's time for the caveat, and there is a major caveat with all of this, and that is to say that there are multiple layers to this propaganda, and obviously the same message is intended to be read by different audiences in different ways. So there is a double danger. One is that knowing that people are listening to what these types of people are saying, and knowing that certain organizations like the CFR are now becoming known for being elite insider organizations that are working against the interests of, well, the United States, obviously, and similar organizations working against the national sovereignty of their own countries, respectively. Well, knowing that, then obviously, as we talked about earlier with Bug Bailey being perhaps a key image for today's episode, well, exactly as in the Dick Tracy movie, when Big Boy finds out that he's being tapped, he starts feeding false information to the Dick Tracy and his cohorts, and Tracy ultimately ends up in trouble because of it. So once again, false information can be fed through the elite to the people who are listening to them if they know that we are listening. That's a bit of a meta-level analysis, but it is a caveat that needs to be kept in mind. And the other caveat is really that since there are multiple layers of propaganda going on in every conversation, it's not always so straightforward to understand exactly what the propaganda is aiming at, or who the real players are, or even how they're connected to each other behind the scenes. And without that information, without those key pieces of information, which sometimes we are simply not privy to, it's impossible to truly understand what a specific context for an utterance is. So let's take a look at an example of that as we start to wrap up today's episode. And this comes from a May 9th